Get started. Give me 1 second. So welcome everyone. I am so excited for you to be here. Today we're going to be talking about incorporating equity into data visualizations. We have a very exciting presenter. And we also have a great agenda planned for you today. So before we get into it, I wanted to highlight some upcoming NNIP month events that you may be interested in attending. So today, here's our agenda. Jon is going to be leading us through a fabulous presentation. Then we'll be having a large group Q&A, a quick break, some breakout groups to kind of discuss the content of the presentation, and then come back and have a little bit of a share out time. We also have a lot of other exciting events this week, or in the next upcoming 2 weeks. Next Tuesday, we have a collaborating for equitable COVID-19 response panel that'll be led by Faye, who's on the call with us today. We have another camp session coming up on the 19th. Please go ahead and vote for suggestions. We're very excited about those. That's a great time to kind of have some peer group discussion and engagement. We will also be having another showcase on the 25th. Also, very engaging sessions and discussions, 6 of them at that time, so you can hear from other NNIP partners. I especially encourage newer folks to come join us at that. And lastly, on May 26th, a panel on what does this moment require, perspectives from philanthropy. We also have informal times for you to kind of get connected with other folks in the network. So if you signed up for Buddy Coffee but haven't had a chance to do that yet, feel free to hit them up and kind of schedule that. We also have the West Coast Happy Hour later today, so pull through for that if you didn't get to join us on Tuesday. And lastly, on May 27th, we'll be having the closeout small group lunches. So with that, I am going to get us started. So as I was thinking about this presentation today, I kept finding similarities between our topic of conversation at our Tuesday event on algorithms in the community. And for those of you who weren't able to join us, our panelists, Katura, Anthony, and Chris, and our wonderful panelist, moderator Michael, walked us through some things, including 1, how automated decision systems can lead to the replication of harm through the standardization and perpetuation of biases. 2, the community role in defining what is safe, what is harmful, and what our steps forward ought to be to mitigate harm. And 3, how starting from a racially inequitable foundation, like dirty data, makes it difficult to get to a racially equitable outcome. This applies to a data visualization conversation because the templates we might feel comfortable using might need to be revisited. So these same themes, I think, like the replication of harm, the importance of centering those most affected by harmful depictions, and the willingness to challenge accepted practices will influence our discussion today. I was also thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's presentation at the 1900 World Exposition Fair in Paris, where he challenged scientific and biological racism with powerful data visualizations, making him the first to combine census data into graphics and a pioneer in the study of sociology and race. That just this year, we saw kind of a resurgence of that. Sekou Tyler, Anthony Starks, and Dan Hirschman launched the hashtag Du Bois Challenge, which has inspired reflection on how we can create racially conscious visualizations, and that technology and software in itself does not necessarily resolve those challenges. So I'm excited to have Jon Schwabish here today with us to lead us through a presentation on just that. He's an expert in data visualization, has written extensively on the topic of compelling and effective data visualization, and has a forthcoming guide, Do No Harm, Applying Equity Awareness in Data Visualization, co-authored with Alice Fung. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Sonia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining this talk. I'm excited to talk with you and work with you later about these important issues. So let me just dive right in. So for those of us, especially for those of us who are working with data, and those of us who are seeking to, in the way that we sort of couch it at Urban at least, is to open minds and shape decisions and offer solutions, we need to, as Sonia just mentioned, we need to start thinking intentionally, or thinking more intentionally about how we can learn from and speak to the audiences that we are working with, that we're working on behalf of, and that we're focusing on. And so this project that Alice and I wrote about last year and are working on a much longer piece that will come out in about a month is really helping, I think, us think about better ways to take a racially equitable view towards data and towards data visualization. And as we all know, over the past year plus or so, following the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, we are starting to have a more open discussion about race, racism, discrimination, harassment in the United States and across the world. And then, so what we can do as people who are working with data is we can start taking a more intentional view towards how we can contribute to this discussion and how we can incorporate those particular perspectives into our work. I am going to just a quick note taking is I'll have the chat window open. If you have any questions while I'm speaking, feel free to drop them in the chat window. So let me, but before I get into content, let me just frame this whole discussion, because talking about race and racial equity from the perspective of and I hate to say middle-aged, but like, especially in the last year, I feel more middle-aged than ever. So middle-aged white guy, you know, I just want to root the entire conversation in my experience, right? So I am a Jewish American, so I have experienced my own experiences with anti-Semitism, but that's clearly not the same as being afraid about, you know, being pulled over by the police or not being able to wear a hooded sweatshirt walking through my neighborhood. So the experiences are very different. But as someone who spends a lot of time conducting research and thinking about data communication, and also the father to two young kids, you know, these issues are really important, obviously really important, and are going to become more important, especially for those of us who are working in the areas of data and data visualization, because of how important our data are, how they are becoming more pervasive in our daily lives, and of course how important data visualization is to communicating content and research to many different audiences. So I think it's important just to recognize that I'm perhaps like not the best person to be coming to this particular issue. But when we started working on this, especially after the murder of George Floyd, there were a lot of people at Urban who were having lots of conversations about, you know, what role or what input can I have into the discussion that we're having? And this was the place where I thought I could lend some expertise and some more thought that has sort of exists in the data visualization field. So what I'm not going to talk about today, and what we don't talk about in the research, are visuals, graphics, depictions, diagrams that are inherently either implicitly or explicitly racist. And there are lots of examples of those. I just wanted to share one with you. This is a map of the city of Richmond, developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the early part of the 20th century. The Hulk was responsible for assessing mortgage risk in metropolitan areas around the country. And I'm going to show you a quote from Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. So Rothstein writes that the Hulk created these color-coded maps of every metro area in the nation, with the safest neighborhoods colored green and the riskiest areas colored red. And he continues that a neighborhood earned a red color if African Americans lived in it, even if it was a solid middle-class neighborhood of single-family homes. So these Hulk created maps are explicitly racist, and these maps have an enduring impact on Black and African American households and cities sort of generally throughout the last 100 years or so. The accumulation and aggregation of wealth among especially African American households was negatively impacted by these maps that changed the wealth accumulation of those householders. So it's important to recognize that there are explicitly racist, explicitly discriminatory data visualizations out there. That is not what we are talking about in this particular project. We are talking to what I hope is the vast majority of people working with data. How do we take a more racially equitable view and awareness to our data and to our data visualizations? And really the through line that comes through in the work which, as I mentioned, was a shorter paper back in 2020. And the newer paper is going to include interviews with more than 24 experts around the country. The through line that comes through is really for those of us who are working with data and communicating data, is to demonstrate empathy for the people that we are focusing on, the communities that we're focusing on, and the people to whom we're trying to communicate. So Kim Bui is a data journalist now in Arizona. And one of the things that she said in one of our interviews was, if I was one of the data points in this data visualization, would I feel offended? And I think if we can take that perspective, if we can think about how would people who are reading our reports or our blog posts or our graphics or audience members or users of the website, how would they perceive themselves in the data, and would they feel offended? That is the first step to taking a more racially equitable view to our work. So I'm going to walk through a number of different topics that we discuss in this project. And hopefully all of them are practical, and hopefully all of them are things that you can start considering and using in your work right away. So the first thing we're going to talk about is language. And I think the first thing I think many of us who are working in this field think about is just using people first language. So instead of using the phrase disabled people, we want to use terms such as people with disabilities. We also want to refer to people and not strictly as to their skin color. So for example, we want to use the phrase Black people as opposed to just the word blacks. And the thing is about language is that it's always evolving, it's nuanced, it's changing, and we can see that even today. So the word Latinx has become sort of popular in trying to take a more gender balanced approach to describing people who are Hispanic or Latino. Now, this book is just an incredible book. If you want to learn more about the origins of the terms Hispanics and Latinos, I really recommend this book by Christina Mora, who's a sociologist at Berkeley. And she looks at the intersection of culture, Spanish language television, and the Census Bureau in the United States, and how those three all came together sort of generate the current words that we use. And she talks about how through their process of creating and asking questions about race and ethnicity, the Census Bureau shifted its perception of race and ethnic categories to kind of understand that these are all fluid and ambiguous rather than these specific words. Now, when it comes to Latinx, it's interesting that while many places are using that phrase more and more, that word more and more, in a August 2020 report from the Pew Research Center, they found that 2/3 of the people that they interviewed who identified as Hispanic or Latino said that the word or phrase Latinx should not be used to describe their population, right? And there's a lot of reasons behind that. One of them is that the letter X is is difficult to pronounce in the Spanish language. So there's a even more current move to use the term Latin, Latine, to even do perhaps even a better job. But for us creating visualizations, we need to be thinking about this people first language and how we want to describe people. So I'm going to show you this. This is just the top third of an interactive Tableau data visualization. And there's one panel here for the Black population in the United States, one for the white population, another one for the Hispanic or Latino population. In each of these, it's 3 maps. Each one is a bivariate choropleth map. So let's first, we need to define the visualization before I can talk about the language. So what's a bivariate choropleth map? Okay, so a choropleth map has a weird name, but it's a map that you've seen all the time. So a choropleth map is adding color to the geographic units in the map. So for example, this is just the unemployment rate in the United States in November of 2020. The lighter colors represent states that have lower unemployment rates, and the darker colors represent states with a higher unemployment rate, okay? A bivariate choropleth map puts 2 variables on the same map and uses that same scaling on the colors to show 2 variables. So this is the bivariate choropleth map. I'm going to zoom in on that legend so you can see what we're looking at. So we have 2 variables. We have the proportion in each county in the United States who identify as Black people, and then the poverty rate in each of these counties. And so in counties that have a higher density of Black residents, we have higher rates of poverty, we're in that really dark purple, almost black color. In counties where we have a lower density of Black residents and a lower poverty rate, we're in those, I guess yellow, sort of peach colored counties. So we can see we have, the big trends that pop up that you can see in the thumbnail is the southeastern part of the United States, and then sort of the Rocky Mountain West in that lower left quadrant for the other variables. Okay, so now that we sort of set up what the map is trying to show us, let's look at the words that are being used here. Okay, first on poverty. Poverty is an experience. Poverty is not a static description of people. I can be in poverty this year, but not in poverty next year. Similarly, when it comes to the phrase more Black, Black references skin color, not people. And if we go back to Eddie Glaude's terrific book, he talks about how color, our skin color, does not say once and for all who we are, right? And so as people who are working with data and thinking about the labels and the language that we use in and around our visualizations, we want to take that perspective. We want to have that empathetic view. If I was if I was a Black or African American living in this country, how would I feel about being described as more Black, right? So that's the through line that comes through to this in this particular project. So what are perhaps some better phrases or words to use? Larger proportion of the Black population, larger proportion of people in poverty. Yes, they're more verbose. Yes, they're longer. Yes, they take more lines, but they're more empathetic. And they're a better description of these two groups. And I just have to, the author and I of the author of the original dashboard and I went back and forth and talked about this at length. And they ultimately changed it from more Black to larger Black population and kept the label for more poverty. But I think even this larger Black population is an improvement over this reference to skin color rather than people or populations. There are other ways that we can do this. This is just a picture from a botanical gardens near me in Northern Virginia. I just love the description of people who are 55 and older, right? Super adults. Like, that's a great positive affirming phrase to use rather than senior citizens or the elderly. So I think anything that we can do working with data, communicating data, that can be more positive, just like our opening little conversation about your positive experiences during the pandemic, I think is a better way to present the data. So I'm not sure, Seema, what color your... Oh, they did. No, that's a good point. They did not change the color. I actually don't know if this is, I haven't actually tested whether this is Black or very, very dark purple. I think it's a great point. I would probably change this to a very, very dark purple and keep that color palette. I think in general, these bivariate color palettes are really difficult to create just in general. And so that's a whole other conversation, but I think it's a really good point. I think if I were to go back and change this some more, I'd probably just, there's a darker purple that you could use here and keep it that way. Okay, so that's language. Let's talk about ordering labels in a purposeful way. And I think this is sort of my, 2-minute elevator pitch of this particular project, which is when you're thinking about ordering your labels, ordering the bars in your bar chart, the labels in your tables, what is the order that you're using? Is it just coming out of how the data are coded, how you've collected it, or is it more purposeful and more strategic? So I just picked out 4 random economics papers and highlighted here the variables in these regression models on race. And as you can see, almost entirely, the order of the coefficients is always ordered white, Black, Hispanic, other. And so do I think that economists are using that approach because they are purposefully ordering coefficients that way? Possibly, but I think it actually more likely comes from our structures in this country. So what I want to do is show you for about 6 different federal surveys the question about race. So this is a question from the decennial census. So hopefully everybody filled out their census form. So question 9 is about race. First question is, option is white with a little area where you can write in more details. Then we have Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native. Then there's a number of other checkboxes here for Asian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian. And then we have at the very bottom some other race. And for some of these, obviously, you can write in more details. Okay, that's the decennial census. Let's look at the current population survey, also conducted by the US Census Bureau. We have the interviewer reads to the interviewee. I'm going to read you a list of 5 race categories. You may choose one or more. And so we have 6 options: white, Black, or African American, down to other. Do not read is not the name of the race, but for the interviewer. Okay, survey of income and program participation. Enter your best guess as to the race of the reference person. So again, for the interviewer, we have 7 categories, 1 to 6, with D referencing I don't know. Survey of consumer finances run by the Federal Reserve Board. We have 8 different categories, 1 to 6, a -7 for other, and then 0 is sort of a missing category. Panel study of income dynamics run by the University of Michigan. We have 6 categories, starting with white, going to 5 for Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and then 7. I don't know why they skip 6. It's always a question I've had and I've never asked. I don't know why they skipped the number 6 for some other race. And then the consumer of expenditure survey. We have 9 different categories here, starting with the first category being white and the last category being other. Now, you may have already picked up on this, but let me click back through each of these surveys and show you the first option in each of these questions. So decennial census, the first option is white. Current population survey, the first option is white. Survey of income and program participation, first option is white. Survey of consumer finances, first option is white. Panel study of income dynamics, first option is white. CES, first option is white. In all of these surveys, the first option is white. All of the race variables are coded: 1 white, 2 Black or African American, et cetera, et cetera. So when I go to the US Census Bureau and download the CPS data, I have these codes referencing these groups, with white always being 1. So when I come to economics journals and I see these regression results, or I see tables ordered white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, other, it's actually not surprising to me, because our federal surveys and our federal structures have incorporated into them these racist structures rooted all the way back through the history of the country. So what can we do instead? Well, if we notice at the decennial census, for example, this is a really nice graphic from the Pew Research Center on the history of the census. Like, if you zoom in here a little bit, the top gray line that's always the same all the way across is always white. It's always the same group. The next group is a combination showing how, I think does a nice job to show how language changes for better and for worse. Black, African American, and then you can see the addition and the movement around of these other groups. So instead of taking our data as it comes, with white being 1, Black being number 2, American Indian or Alaskan Native being 3, we need to take this a more strategic, more thoughtful approach to how we want to present our results. So how can we do that? Well, first off, we need to recognize the structural inequalities in our data systems, that, as Sonia mentioned in a previous session. So what can we do as individuals when we're working with our data, presenting our data? First, does your study focus on a particular community? If it does, perhaps that group should be presented first. Is there a particular argument or story that you're trying to tell? And if you are trying to tell a particular argument or a particular story or a particular presentation, perhaps that group should come first in your presentation of those results. And then finally, is there a quantitative relationship that can guide how the groups are ordered? This could be alphabetically. So that's one possibility. It could be by population size, which would still place the white population in that first position. It could also be sample size. It could also be the weighted sample size or the unweighted sample size. Or, and I think probably the best approach, is the magnitude or the effect of the results, because that's really what we're trying to focus on when we are, or what we're often trying to argue when we're presenting our results, that these results are this is the biggest impact of this particular policy on this particular group. So I think the main argument here is to think about not just how the data show up, or if you are doing your own data collection, which is a whole other piece, that a whole other topic that is worth discussing. When you're collecting your own data, how are you actually going to structure the survey? And does it take this white or male or cisgender norm as the default, as the first option in each of these questions? Okay, so I've talked about language and ordering labels. Now we can talk about missing groups. And this is going in a sort of different direction, that if the data in your data set, there's a data point missing or a data value missing. I'm really thinking about the root of the survey itself. And I think the easiest, best way to think about this is when we think about how surveys ask about gender, right? Gender is almost always asked male, female, right? All of those major surveys that I just showed you, the question is male, female. We know that gender is not binary. So again, if your project is to create a survey, how would you feel if you don't identify as male or female when you are creating that survey and you're being asked that question? There was a great little Twitter discussion about the worst online forms for asking about gender, and these are just a few of the 40 that were shared. The first one here is my favorite: female, male, NA, unknown, and tax entity. Who's creating these sort of drop-down menus, that tax entity, what we're asking about. This is another just sort of, I think, even simpler example, just to highlight or demonstrate that by aggregating lots of different groups, we miss out in the variance, in the differences in particular populations, particular groups. During the election, you can see here in Florida, the preference for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump it's almost the exact opposite in the Cuban population as it is in the Puerto Rican population. So just one example of how aggregating certain groups, or maybe any group, really leads to a loss of detail and variation that can be important. Okay, so now when we have these aggregate groups, what do we do about what is often labeled as the other category, right? This is another extension of language, and it's a real challenge for many of us who are working with data. So this is the entry from the Merriam-Webster dictionary of the word other. What struck me about this definition is the fifth entry in this dictionary entry, which is disturbingly or threateningly different. So I think there is a connotation that the word other, threatening or disturbing. And so when we have a survey, for example, that says white, black, Asian, other, there's a connotation there that the word other is enveloping a disturbing or threatening group. Now, what can we use as an alternative to the word other? Because the word other is literally othering people. So what are some alternative words that we can use? So I think the one that I've heard most often is to use the word another, which I think is okay. It doesn't quite, when you look at the grammatically, it doesn't quite work, right? You'd want another to be in this sort of first part of this definition. So it doesn't quite work, but that's okay. Like, language is evolving. We've thought about a few other definitions, a few other alternatives to this word other that we think people communicating data can use. Another race or races, additional groups, all other self-descriptions, people identifying as other or multiple races, identity not listed, or identity not listed in the survey. Here's the one caveat that I will mention. And I'm mostly a quantitative researcher. So when I think about presenting the results and saying, I'm going to change the word other from the survey, I get a little bit uneasy. I think uneasy is the word. And the reason is because when I fill out that survey, the person who checked the box next to the word other, that was the option that they chose. They checked that box. And so the question is, and I think it's an open question, to be honest, is it okay for me as the communicator of the data to change that word? Okay, so hopefully you're following what the argument is here. Where I've sort of come down on this personally is that, or the technique or the strategy that I think I've started to use, and I think that what we're sort of recommending is, if that bothers you, to use one of these other descriptions or another phrase that you think is better than the word other, and then to say in the text or the table or in a footnote, we're using the phrase all other self-descriptions, which is factually true, right? Still factually true. We're using the phrase all other self-descriptions instead of the word other that was used in the survey, because we believe the phrase, or as Anthony said, additional groups, which is another great one. We're using the phrase additional groups because we think it's more inclusive. We think it's more aware of these different issues that we want to take into consideration. So I don't think it's like one or the other, right? I think we can have both of it if that's a concern of yours about changing the option in the survey itself, in the data itself. I think that's the resolution to that, or the solution to that, I think, is just to add a note. I just want to pause and just take a look. There's a couple questions in here. So Shiloh has this is the question that like haunts me as I'm working on the final draft of this paper. Like, I mean, so here's so let me make it let me take a tweak on your question and make it a little more practical. If you go into the CPS file, for example, or the ACS, the American Community Survey is a better example. There are about 140, I think they have about 140 different race categories that you can use in your analysis. They also have a more grouped version that I think has like 6 or 7 sort of grouped categories. And the one that always comes up, that one that sort of bothers me the most, is Asian or Pacific Islander, because the Asian American community in the United States is very varied, is very varied. So if you look at poverty rates, and I have an urban blog post about this that we can share in a little bit, Pacific Islanders tend to have much higher poverty rates than people identify as Asian American. So there's a lot of variation going on in that group. But the question is, as when I'm working with data, as I'm doing my statistical regressions, as I'm making bar charts, there's also a bit of a trade-off between a bar chart with 6 categories versus 140 categories. And so this is the thing that keeps me up at night. And these are the things that is part of this project, is to sort of figure out. There's no, as you can tell, I don't have any answers to these questions. It's just sort of trying to raise these issues. I'm just going to go back to the questions here. So I think Anna has a great point. Like, you know, I can't like assign an identity for other people. And that's why the other category, now I will say for the other category, I do feel like I can use some of these other phrases, because I think all of these are factually true. Like, people identifying as other or multiple races, that is technically true when they check that other box. They have identified themselves as that other box. So I think there's you don't want to start assigning labels to people that they haven't themselves chosen. I think the other category which we're focusing on in this particular part is one that's a common challenge. And Anthony notes here, changing the word black, lowercase b, to a capital B. Is also a style, I think is a style that we've adopted at Urban in urban editing as well. So thanks for these. There's a lot of great links in here that I'm not opening, so I can keep talking. So hopefully Leah or Sonia are keeping these for me, so I can take a look at them later. So thanks for sharing those. I think we can all agree that this table from CNN is the absolute wrong way to do it. White, Latino, Black, something else. I think we can all agree that we definitely want to refer to people and not as objects. So I think we can all agree that this is like the worst way to do it. Okay, so we've talked about language, we've talked about ordering labels, we've talked about the concept of the other. Let's talk about colors. So it's also obviously a really important part of data visualization is the colors that you use in your graphs, charts, and diagrams. So I'm going to show you again an example, because again, I'm not focusing on, you know, the Hulk, the map from the Hulk agency is sort of is explicitly racist, but the issue is really generally is more subtle. So this is from MIT. They have a Tableau dashboard that shows race and ethnicity data in their student body. And so you can see here that they have a line chart on the left that shows patterns over time, and on the right is the breakdown of different racial groups. What I'm going to do is, just like before, I'm going to zoom in to the legend. And so this is the legend that was in the first version of this dashboard that I found. This was in June of 2020. And so you can see here that they have 9 different categories. We start on the top left with Black or African American, work our way down to Asian in that first column. In the second column, we have 2 or more races, then we have white, and then international students, and then students who don't identify their race. So what's the issue with this? Well, let's go back to our choropleth map of the unemployment rate. So remember that in this particular map, lighter colors represent lower unemployment rates and darker colors represent higher unemployment rates. So there's at least two problems with this legend from MIT. First is that they are grouping all of the students of color into these shades of red. So you've got all the students of color in these shades of red. White students are their own category in the blue color. Then the international students and the students who don't identify their race in these categories of gray. So that's the first problem with this legend as I see it, that you've got this grouping of students of color versus the white, where the white is deemed the norm because that's its only group gets its own color. I think perhaps even more importantly, and one that's a subtle problem with this legend, is the color ramp going from the lighter red for two or more races to the dark red for students who identified as Black or African American. It is just like that sequential color palette used in that unemployment rate graph. It is suggesting, implicitly suggesting, a ranking of these students from lower to higher. So what happened about a month later, there was some pushback about this dashboard on Twitter, and so they changed the dashboard to this. So you can see they've moved towards, I think, a better approach. Black or African American students are now in green. There's still shades of blue here in these four categories of race: Hispanic or Latino, American Indian, Native Hawaiian, or Asian. Then you have two or more races in purple, white in the sort of peach color, international students in red, and then the students who didn't identify in the gray. Is it better? Yes. Is it easy to come up with 9 different colors? No, it's not easy to come up with 9 different colors. It's not necessarily the easiest set of colors to come up with. But just to note that there are multiple problems with these particular color palettes. First, again, grouping students of color versus the white norm, in addition to this these color ramp going from a lighter, for example, here going from a lighter blue to a darker blue. Brittany makes a really good point about the color red in American culture, which is obviously different than in Asian colors. Asian cultures, for example, red is deemed to be red is perceived as a more positive celebratory color. So absolutely is a good point on our choices of color. Okay, so now we've talked about color. Now let's talk about icons. Icons are a great way, sorry, I haven't had enough caffeine today, a great way to visualize data, but also can be a real challenge. And so I want to show you this visualization. I'll let you just check that one out for a second. And a couple issues with this icon graph, right? First, we start the axis as something other than 0, which is going to distort the data. By using icons and sizing them in this particular way, we're sizing the icons not just on the vertical dimension, but also on the horizontal dimension. So our perception of the data is basically on the area of the icons. So when I first saw this was sort of showed up on Twitter, and people were just ridiculing it as a, terribly offensive, terrible use of icons in this visualization. But I want to show you a tweet from Saba Ibrahim, who's a fabulous photographer. She posted this in August of 2020. It's a little small, so I'll just read it aloud for you. She tweets, "As an Indian woman, I can confirm that too much of my time is spent hiding behind a rock, praying the terrifying gang of international giant ladies and their Latvian general don't find me." Now, when I show this, lots of people sort of smile and laugh, and I think she did intend it to be sort of funny and tongue-in-cheek. She and I did DM on Twitter about this. But I think that this tweet is the perfect representation of how people see themselves in data, right? So again, to have that through line of empathy for people who are reading our visualizations. In this case, even though it's a sort of funny tongue-in-cheek tweet, she's seeing herself in the data. And so how would you feel if you saw yourself in the data in this particular way? Could also extend this more generally. If you go to Google right now and you search in the image part of, you do a Google image search for nurse icon, you're going to find pages of icons that we would generally identify as feminine. you did the same Google search for boss icon, and you're going to find images that we would identify as masculine. So again, our imagery in our culture, in our data visualizations is still rooted in this structural racism, structural gender inequality, stereotypical depictions of people and communities. So we just need to be careful about the visualizations that we use. Now, some chart types do lend themselves, I think, to presenting data to people in better ways than others. So for example, we have a simple bar chart here, millions of people in poverty around the world. But the bar chart, what the bar chart does is it's a abstract representation of the data. It collapses all the people down into these bars. An icon chart, for example, for this chart, this latter chart type might allow people to see themselves better in the data, might enable them to connect better with the subject matter by reminding them that there are people in the data behind the chart. So it's not just that we have bars, observations aggregated into bars, that are actually showing them a representation of people. Okay, the last thing I wanted to mention was the importance of gauging or reflecting lived experiences. And this is really, I think, a challenge, especially for those of us who tend to be more quantitative researchers. In my experience, quantitative researchers, as I mentioned, an economist by training, by background, I had zero qualitative methods training, education in graduate school. Whereas most, if not all of the people that I know who are primarily qualitative researchers, all the sociologists I know, all the demographers I know, they have had at least some basic quantitative training. And what the qualitative methods allow us to do is to connect with people and allow us to connect our research with the people that we are trying to communicate with, be them communities, be them stakeholders, be them policymakers. Whereas, I've seen a million bar charts today. It doesn't really necessarily help me connect with the data. So one of the other messages that we're trying to get across in this project is to try to move quantitative researchers closer to qualitative researchers, to try to get them to better connect with the communities and the people that they are communicating with and the communities and people that they're focusing on. So as we are thinking about the people that we are focusing on, we need to be asking ourselves some important questions as researchers. Are we using language that's consistent with how people refer to themselves and others? I think one of the great examples is the phrase Latinx, where in some communities around the country, Latinx is a preferred word or phrase, and in other communities, it's not. In our discussion with researchers at University of California, Los Angeles, they are interacting. This particular research group works with the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community in Southern California. They have an existing relationship with those communities and with those groups. So they are asking those communities, they are working with those communities hand in hand to better understand what language the researchers should and should not use in their research projects. Have we missed, or what have we missed in our visuals and in our graphs and our diagrams that are inconsistent within a racial equity framework? Are we using icons that are not consistent with a racial equity framework? Are we using colors? And you've already mentioned a few in the chat window. So are we using colors? Are we using words? Are we using visuals that are not consistent with that framework? And how can we take a more empathetic approach to creating visuals that respectfully account for other people's lived experiences? And I think the way that we can do this is to start to communicate more with the people and communities that we are working with. This does not mean that the research should not be objective, that the communities dictate what should and should not go on in the visualizations or in the research or in the models. It is instead to better understand and to, as I note here, respectfully account for those experiences so that when we present the results, we're presenting them in a respectful way and trying to bring in the communities into our research. I think one of the other outcomes of this approach, of taking this more collaborative approach with the communities, is that the work is more likely to be embraced and to be utilized where we hope it's going to be worked. There is a great group in Chicago called Chicago Beyond, where they've written a lot about research that are coming from, from down on high to tell communities how they should or should not do certain things, certain policies, certain experiences, where if we're able to work with communities, we're going to be better able to have the outcomes of our research and our work and our recommended policies actually embraced by the communities because they feel like a key stakeholder in the research. I also wanted to mention, especially for this group, since you're all working in groups and teams, to think about how the makeup in your groups and your teams interacts with the data and the visualizations. And so if you've read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which is just an amazing book about the origins of race in the United States, she writes, here, the human impulse to create hierarchies runs across societies and cultures. So the fact that race as a construct is built into our human impulses. And so to take a more racially equitable view of our data and our data visualizations, we need to also take that view into the teams and the groups that we are working in and for. So the culture in our organizations is going to feed into our analysis, and our analysis is going to feed back into our culture. And I think it's it's a relatively easy thing to say without thinking any harder about it, that our teams, our organizations, our groups should be diverse. And I think that's where people sort of leave it, that we should have more diversity in our groups and our organizations. But the next level of thinking about that for those of us who are working with data is, how does that diversity help our analysis, right? It's not just that having more diverse groups helps generally. It also helps specifically because we can build in a diversity of perspectives and diversity of experiences into the analysis. So for example, if I'm working on nutrition issues for kids during the pandemic, how do we get food to kids in low-income families? And if I'm not a parent, but I work with people who are parents, it's just a simple basic example, I can have conversations with those parents to understand, at least in my bubble, in my organization, the struggles that they might have. And they might be able to connect me with the PTA at their school or the food bank in their community to better understand those experiences. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that while obviously having a more diverse group and teams and organizations is important and is beneficial, I think for those of us who are working with data, we need to push that ahead a little bit and see how that diversity actually interacts with the analysis that we're conducting, the data that we're collecting, and the data that we're visualizing. So I'm gonna just wrap up here and note, as I think, as hopefully you have picked up today, that the data that we are collecting, using, analyzing, and visualizing are a reflection of the lives of real people. They're not just bars in a bar chart. They're not just lines in a line chart. They are reflections of real people. And I think if we as analysts, as researchers, as data visualization specialists, data visualizers, there's still not a good term for that, data visualizers, can have more empathy for the people that we are focusing on, the communities that we're focusing on, and the people and communities that we are trying to communicate with, I think we'll all be better off and help create better policies and a better world. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank you already for what I hope will be a great second hour, and I'm looking forward to having some conversations with you.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I'll just speak for myself that the the combination of the quantitative perspective with the qualitative at the end merged with like very practical considerations, I think is like very helpful, because I think this process of like interrogating how to construct data visualization is that interplay between like the larger question of how we are connecting to racial equitable outcomes generally in all that we do, and then grounding ourselves in the actual practical changes we can make, and back and forth and back and forth. So I think it was very helpful that you layered it that way. So thank you so much.
you.
Well, it looks like we are ready for our Q&A time. However, you've done a great job of looking through questions. So I'd like to invite people to put questions in the chat, unmute themselves for the next few minutes, and then we'll be going to a break.
I'm just going back through some of the comments here, just to see if there's anything I didn't answer. So I think I answered all of these. Okay, so let me see, April. Thanks, April, for your question. So I think April, if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about the association or correlation between race, ethnicity, and in your example, housing prices. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. So, a lot of the examples that you walked through were data where race, ethnicity was very obvious. And we know that there are data impacted by race and ethnicity. It's not always.
Yeah, it's like more subtle.
Mm-hmm. Do you have recommendations for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think. Well, so maybe I'll broaden this a little bit. I think, and I don't think this isn't necessarily a problem in all fields, but it's certainly a problem in economics, where people will include controls or statistics about race and ethnicity, and then just move on, right? So they'll, let's just take housing prices as an example. So they're doing a study on housing prices, and they'll have a regression model, or they'll have a table of results that has something like, here in my sample I have % of men, % of women, % of Black people in the community, % of white people in the community, median income, et cetera, et cetera. And then they just sort of move on. But those numbers, those findings, even if they're not central to the discussion, they are representing something. So I have a paper that my former urban colleague Kalilo Kijikazi wrote on racism and economics, where if you run a regression and race is part of the covariates, and there's, let's just say, a statistically significant positive covariate on controls for Black-headed households, and you don't say anything about that, that coefficient is measuring something. It's saying something. So we need, as people, I'll just talk for economics because I'm sure not everybody here is in the field, but in economics, we need to acknowledge that finding is saying something, and it's likely saying something about the structures, the institutions in our society that have been occurring for 400 years, that have disproportionately affected communities and people of color. So, I think it's not so easy to talk about that, especially in our thanks, Leah, especially in our current academic publishing process, where if you sort of stray away from the central thesis, the reviewer, the editor, the peer reviews will ding you for it. But it's important to recognize that when you find this coefficient, it's measuring something. And so to the sort of the back to your basic question, I think we as researchers need to start addressing these findings, that while they might be incidental to the core hypothesis that we're trying to test, they are meaningful, and they're saying something about the experiences of those people and communities.
In the economics point really quickly, we also kind of assume, for instance, our null hypothesis to be racism does not exist in the valuation of homes or prices. That's another way that I think relates to your question, where the underlying assumption is that racism does not exist, whereas data regularly contradicts that. So making that assumption and then changing from that seems to be something that we should suspect. We have another question from Anna saying, do you have ideas about how to curb misunderstandings of data that may be interpreted in a racist way? For example, incarceration rates by race.
So, I mean, I think what am I trying to say? I think the fastest way, the most practical way to think about this is to be very intentional with the text in and around your graph, especially the title. So maybe I can do this real quickly and bring, maybe I can bring this up real quick. Give me just 1 second. So there is a book that I recommend everybody read, Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. And I'm going to try to find this part in this paper. Here we go. All right, I'm going to share again. So as an example, so we interviewed Catherine and Lauren. So this is the next iteration of this project. So the first paper was 4 pages. We thought we were going to write a 15-page paper. We ended up writing a 53-page paper. So there's more to come on this. So this is actually directly to the question here. It's actually on the same topic. So this is from their book. And I'm not going to read all this here, but so they move through three graphs here. So mental health in jail is the first title here, rate of mental health diagnosis of inmates. So that's one issue, is the word inmates. Then we can move to a title that more accurately reflects the findings of the research, right? Racism in jail, and names, I'm just highlighting the sentence here, right? Names the forces of oppression, racism in prison, and also references people of color rather than the word inmate. And then we could take it one more step to, and I think someone had mentioned this in the chat window, not a deficit-based framing. You know, why is it all, the question that they basically ask in this part of the book is, why in this, when these two, or in this framing, why is it people of color? Why is that the focal point? Whereas here, racism in jail, flipping that that perspective, that is not a deficit-based framing, but instead saying, why do white people get more mental health diagnoses among people who are incarcerated? So I think a sort of, I'll say quick practical thing that you could do is try to embrace this work in the text, in and around your graphs. And we know there is a bit of research that shows that people do read titles and text in and around their graphs. So it's not that people just look at the bars or the lines or the dots in your chart. They actually are reading text. And so one of the big things that I try to focus on is using the texts, especially titles, being active and being purposeful about the text that you write in those titles. So what do you want people to get out of the graph? It's really easy to say, for example, I don't know, labor force participation rate, comma, men and women, comma, 1950 to 2020, right? That's descriptive. It's a better title to say the labor force participation rate has declined for men and has gone up for women, right? That second title is more active and tells the reader what they're supposed to get out of the graph. And a lot of times when I talk to clients, they'll say, well, I can't use that latter active title because people will think we're being biased or we're not being objective. And I'll say, okay, I get that. Let's see if we can figure out a different title that will meet both of these needs, of something that's active but doesn't bias, you don't think is being biased. And you look at the text, and the text will literally say, in figure 1, you can see that the labor force participation rate has gone down for women, or has gone down for men, has gone up for women. So there is, in so much of our academic writing, there is this break between what we write in the text and what we put in the graphs. And so blending those two together is, I think, a good strategy to sort of be able to tell your story in a better way, and then specifically to Anna's question, to take this awareness into your visualizations and into your research.
A COVID relevant example that I've also seen is it's not that people of color experience disproportionate rates of COVID death or morbidity, but it is that people racialized as people of color in the US
Yeah.
experience increasing rates of COVID death. And we get into the wordiness problem, but that's
right. And I know that's yeah, that's a challenge, but it's just a challenge, right? Like we have the entire English language at our disposal to try to come up with better phrasing and better words.
Exactly. We'd be here all day. So
Yeah.
Ashley asks, can you speak to best practices around what to do if the size of racial or ethnic groups is so small that you have concerns about reporting the data? By omitting it, you don't want to make it look like those folks don't matter or aren't a part of the community.
That's a great question. And I'll say that one of the pushbacks we got on this first draft of this paper was from the research community, actually, because I think a lot of the way that we initially had written the report was it seemed to imply that communities should own the research, or that this racial equity awareness or gender awareness or any group awareness should take precedent over the objectivity or the truthfulness of the research. And that's really not what we were not what we were applying. So at the end of the day, the research needs to be truthful, right? And the research needs to be accurate and objective. So how do we get to a position, or how do we address as researchers a position where, just as Ashley notes, where we have a small sample size? And I think we need to be, just the way we were talking about earlier about acknowledging the racist structures in our society and in our country when we're writing about our results. I think we need to do the same when we're presenting results in our papers, or in our research. If it is not, I don't think, and I could be wrong, other people can disagree with me, I don't think it's unfair to say we're unable to, or we did not find statistically significant results for this particular group or this other group because there were not enough, we did not have enough observations in the survey. We can take it one step further, though, to ask, and I haven't seen the other session, but I think this is the session that Sonia was alluding to earlier. We can ask the question of, why do we not have enough observations of this particular group in our data set, right? Is the survey itself based on structures and institutions that are not appropriately focusing on, on these different groups? I'll take it a step further and say, and what I haven't talked about, obviously this work is focusing primarily on race and ethnicity. There's the intersectionality of all these different characteristics of people leads to the exact same issue that Ashley is talking about, right? When you start looking at let's just say crosstabs of gender, race, age, ethnicity, location, you start to slice the data pretty small. And so I don't have a best practice. I think I don't have an answer. I think the technique that we should be trying is to be more honest about what we have and don't have in our data. That we need to acknowledge the fact that, the results that we are talking about in this particular research project, we're unable to say something about group X, Y, and Z because the data that we're using, while useful for our particular purposes in an aggregate sense, are not particularly good for not particularly good for groups that we might want to focus on because of the structures of the data. So Ashley, I don't know if that helped. So I'm sorry I don't have like the answer on that one, but it is a big challenge. Yeah.
Great. So we are running a little bit low on time, but I like the questions in the chat, so we'll take the last three before we move on to the break. Seema asks, moving from quant to qual generate adds a lot of time to a project. How can we create those infographics quickly-ish? And how can we ground the quantitative findings quickly-ish?
Sorry, yeah, I'm just looking for her question. Oh, Seema, okay. So I think the answer to, so Seema, that's a great question. And moving, so I think the answer to the question is, well, okay, so first off, very few of these issues are things that you're going to be able to fix today, right? I think that's just like, you know, the Census Bureau isn't going to change how they order race in the American Community Survey today. So lots of these things are going to be things that change, that are going to need to change over time. Obviously, things like using alternatives for the word other and thinking about how you label your words are things that we can do today. To this point, I think we need to take the long view, that we need to think about how in our universities, organizations, within our teams, how can we build in these processes going forward? So you're working on a project right now. You might not be able to add in a qualitative component to the research right now. But what about the project that you're going to be starting in 4 months? Can we start at the beginning of that project to think about what is a way that we as the research team can embrace more qualitative methods? And I want to just make another secondary point on this, that again, as I mentioned, I'm a quantitative researcher, right? And so a lot of the questions that I had for a lot of our people that we interviewed in this project were, how can quantitative researchers be more qualitative? How can they talk to the people and communities that they're focusing on? And especially our data journalists, their answer was always, well, you ask them, you get on the phone and you ask a question. And my response is that, like, okay, but what number do I dial? Like, it's such an easy thing to be like, you just jump on the phone. Like, okay, but like I've spent my education was like coding in Stata, right? So like, what's the magic number that I call, right? And I think where the sort of, I keep using this word through line, but I think it's the right phrase. What came up was building the relationships both within the team and then the team to the community, and then maintaining those relationships. So one of an interesting story from this team at UCLA, and it's led by Nina Ponce at UCLA. I'll just put her name in here. One of the points that they made in our interview with them is that the relationships that they have, especially with the Native Hawaiian community, were built over a longer period of time, and that the way the Native Hawaiian community prefers to have this relationship is not via email. It's not via, well, obviously Zoom is different in the world we are now, but they like to have face-to-face, in-person conversations. And so the relationship that the research team built with the local Native Hawaiian community was built over a longer period of time. And they start their research process by having those groups integrated into the process from the beginning. So I think back to Seema's particular question, I don't know how we do this quickly. I think this is something that we need to build into our entire research process from the very beginning to the very end, which is maybe not the most satisfying answer, because you probably have a research project that you're trying to do now. But I think we all need to take this more, which is frustrating, but to take it in the long view.
Awesome. And I'm going to try to combine these last two questions because I think they're a little related. Amy asks, minoritized communities often are upset at how deficits-focused data about their community always is. How do you balance the importance of calling out important inequities while also not re-stigmatizing communities? And relatedly, Shiloh asks, what do you think about moving away from focusing on disadvantaged communities in our analysis visualizations to turning the lens on the potential oppressor dominant?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think lead back in just a simple, basic way to, and practical way, back to the data feminism approach, right? Where they flipped the perspective. I'll share it again, just real quickly. The original graph, the first graph, mental health in jail, really doesn't tell you anything, doesn't call out the racist structures for people who are incarcerated. The second one calls out the racist structure, but it focuses on people of color, right? And the third, I never know if I should say the second alternative or the third alternative, the other version of this, right? Because it's like the third, okay, you get the idea. The third version here is still calling out the racist structures, but flipping the, I guess, the focus around to exactly the way that both the comments alluded to, which is focusing on not the minoritized group or the people of color, but on the majority group, or on the what many sort of well, what is often in our data viewed and collected as the norm or as the oppressor group. So I think that's one way that we as researchers can start to think about this, that instead of focusing on, you know, our finding for Black-headed households is X, Y, and Z, and ignoring all of the structural racism that is present in our structures and our institutions, we instead flip that around a little bit and we think about how have white-headed households, for example, or how has the history in the particular in the case of housing, how has that impacted generations of wealth and Black-headed households? So again, I don't have like answers to these. This is like sort of a longer thought piece of how can we as researchers and data analysts evolve to a better place in the way that we talk about, well, for those of you who are collecting data, for how we collect data, for how we use data, and then how we communicate about the data.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the cool thing is, you don't have to have all the answers. That's why we're all here together, working on it together. So now we're going to take a 5-minute break, everyone. I think that puts us at 1:23. So get ready to come back on camera if you can, and then we're going to go into breakout groups. So 5 minutes, and then we'll be back. See you in a bit. I think everyone's back by now, but we talked a little bit about language in our group, a lot about language actually, and a little bit about how we engage communities in making those decisions, who gets left out of the room, how do we adjust when things change. So thank you for that. Can I hear from some of the other groups and also my group? What were some interesting things that came up that you're going to take away from this conversation?
I think we talked a lot about thinking about how to connect to community to get data interpreted, and also if people have resources, justifying why that's so valuable to do, so that your funders will approve larger budgets to accommodate the quantitative and qualitative work. We were interested in sharing those. Others?
So yeah, our group also sort of talked about community engagement and how to bring that into the work. I think also sort of how to do that along the sort of research process, sort of how to do that earlier to sort of incorporate it throughout your work. We also sort of talked about some of the limitations of how data is collected, and sort of what you're able to say or how you're able to report or talk about your data.
Shiloh said you had a good point that got cut off as the room closed.
Yeah, maybe an average point at best. I was just saying that part of and I think Jon brought this up as well, right? But within Urban Greater DC, we're talking a lot about how to be an anti-racist organization, but anti-racism sort of has a sort of stance built into it. You're sort of taking a stance by naming that, particularly when sort of racism is politicized in the way that it is, and sort of how to square that with some of the principles of, you know, accuracy and, you know, sort of justifiable data analysis that we're all, you know, very deeply involved in, and how to do both of those things in a responsible way. It's just sort of an ongoing question that I have.
That is a good question.
A quick point I wanted to add was that in our conversation about how language evolves and who gets to make decisions about what type of language we use, we talked about the role of the researcher and what do you say in your presentation when you've chosen a particular word or what you've chosen to communicate in a certain paper. And we talked about referring back to the data set, making decisions based off of like the regional context, because of course, as we talked in the in the presentation, as John mentioned, a lot of people center white as kind of the first racial demographic that's reported. So that's a choice that we can make. And if we choose to deviate from that source, just providing some language as to how that's an evolving conversation, it's a decision that was made by the research team, but something that people are open to. So I'd be curious to hear if people have quick thoughts about that too.
I'd also love just to collect examples of people who have tried to flip the script. I think like some of the ones that John was showing with the people involved in jail and getting mental health services. It would be great to have examples to share across the network when you were able to kind of do that. So feel free to send those to nnip@urban.org as you create them.
I think also just quickly, one of the things that John made me think of that I think is a little bit past visualization, right? But it's just remembering, especially right when we talk about race, when we're counting things and we're just saying, okay, we're just showing like a pie chart of the population or something. When we're being descriptive, then race is race. But when we're doing an analysis and race is a variable, maybe it's a control variable, or maybe maybe we think it means something, I mean, it's included for some reason, right? And there's an effect, and we're going to talk about the fact is not just, and John touched on this a bit, right? But it's saying, and really explicitly making that decision to say, okay, when I see that race has an impact, if I see that there's a correlation here, is asking and stating whether or not is it race or is it racism, right? It's collected as race, and when we're being descriptive, we're talking about race. But when we're talking about its impact, is the impact race? Is it the fact of being Black, or is it anti-Black racism, right? And so just knowing that difference between when you're being descriptive and when you're being analytical, that the impact in the analysis is probably not of race, right? But rather it is of racism, and saying that explicitly, not that race. So race correlates, race has this, and no, race isn't doing it, right? And so let's talk about what it is that's actually doing the thing, right? What is the what's the mechanism that's correlated there to the change? So I think that's not necessarily in the visualization, but as we move past and we're describing the visualization, we're doing the analysis. So.
Awesome. To close this up, I just want to lift up something that Katie said in our group. Being humble is really important when we have conversations with community. It's going to be a humbling conversation, and that's part of the process, and that's welcome and important. And it's also an ongoing process. So that is also part of the humbling experience. And with that, John, if you have any closing thoughts, and then we can go.
Oh, I mean, this was great. I have to say, like, when I give this talk, it's just, you give talk, people say thanks and you move on. And the feedback here has been fantastic. The conversations were fantastic. And I think I wanted to echo Anthony's, what Anthony just mentioned. And I think it ties directly into what Michael was mentioning, right? That it is a tricky thing, right? I think all of us on this call sort of believe that we should have these anti-racist approaches to our life and our work. And can we start to do that? I don't think it I think I'm struggling with Michael and I having the same brain. We're on the same wavelength, like struggling with some of these same issues. But I think we can take sort of an anti-racist stance in our research without necessarily not being objective, right? Where I think Anthony sort of hit that nail on the head, where we can call these things out. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're taking a position or a stance, but we're saying, I have this finding on race in my regression model. I'm not just going to blow by it. I'm just going to say, well, it's a control variable. It doesn't really matter. We can say it's saying something, and I don't necessarily know what it's saying, but it's saying something, and it's worth at least shining a spotlight on the fact that this finding is saying something. I don't know what it is. It's not necessarily the focal point of this analysis, but it's saying something about the experience, about our structures, about our society that we need to pay attention to. So I just want to thank all of you for what was just a great event. And I'll echo Leah's last point about, if you have other examples, please send them on, both good and bad. The good ones are always more fun to see and better to see and more affirming than the bad ones, but the bad ones let us learn, sometimes better than the good ones. So yeah, if you could send those along, I'd love to see them. I already collected a few from my notes. So I'll just say thanks so much, everybody. This was a really great event.
And thank you, Jon, so much for taking time to join us. We will share the slides and the video and your paper when it's published with everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. Have a great day and see you at the rest of NNIP month.
Yeah.